Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's TLL Speaker Series event, How Instructors Can Support Student Wellbeing. I'm Janet Rankin, the Director of the Teaching and Learning Lab, and I'm having a terrible day of internet connectivity or non-internet connectivity, so I apologize for not having my camera on. Today, we're thrilled to welcome Megan Kennedy and Robin Evans Agnew from the University of Washington. Megan Kennedy is the director of the University of Washington's Resilience Lab and the co-chair of the UW Student Wellbeing Collaborative. At UW, she leads the strategic initiatives to support student mental health and well-being. Megan has a background in mental health counseling, and before joining the UW community, she served as a clinical director in Youth Eastside Services in Redmond, Washington. And Robin Evans Agnew is an associate professor at University of Washington Tacoma School of Nursing and Healthcare Leadership. There he focuses on upstream actions to transform inequalities, especially as they relate to asthma and environmental justice and trauma-informed nursing practice. His current work involves a research study with Latino caregivers of children with asthma and trauma-informed pedagogy for healthcare system leaders. Today, Megan and Robin will tell us about their work on the Wellbeing for Life and Learning initiative led by University of Washington's Resilience Lab. The goal is to help instructors design learning environments that promote well-being. And as a note, if you have not had the opportunity to browse UW's guidebook entitled Wellbeing for Life and Learning, I can't recommend it strongly enough. It's amazing. I sat down with it over the weekend and was just really impressed by it. It's a fabulous resource. So we'll send the follow-up, but just a personal, sincere plug for that for sure. So please, let's jump into what the speakers promise will be a highly interactive workshop. And Megan and Robin, welcome.
Thank you, Janet, and thank you, Ryan. It's been really wonderful to work with you both in preparing for today's event. And though Robin and I would love to be on the East Coast with you in person, it's great to be able to connect in this really easy way through Zoom to be here presenting today. So, and thanks for providing those introductions. I think what Robin and I will do, we'll just add maybe a little bit to the intros just to tell you a little bit more about kind of how we came to be engaged in this work. So just sharing briefly, as you mentioned, Janet, I have a background as a licensed mental health therapist. So I spent about a decade in community-based mental health work, providing counseling to young people and their families, and really spent quite a bit of my time supporting, in particular, the LGBTQ queer and trans youth community and their families. And the reason I mention this is because it was in serving that community specifically where I began to really think about how the environment and the conditions of the systems that supported or didn't support those young people really influenced their mental health and well-being. And so while on one hand, I was interested in helping develop the stress coping mechanisms of those youth and their families, I was also really interested in thinking about how do we intervene at more systems levels to kind of address the stressors that are present in the first place. And so it's kind of toggling between those different types of systems, the individual and family system, and then the larger systems that surround the youth and their families, that my work ended up moving and shifting from community-based mental health over to the university, where I was brought in to think about really a comprehensive plan for the university around preventing suicide, looking at suicide prevention from a systems perspective. From there, I moved into a position as the manager of strategic initiatives for student wellness, which sat in the student life side of the house at the University of Washington. And in that role, I was able to kind of have a balcony perspective, really thinking about the system writ large and identifying places where we could begin to work in a more collective approach toward common outcomes, and really beginning to connect the dots between different systems so that we're all kind of working in tandem with each other to support students. And then finally, in the last year, I've been the director of the UW Resilience Lab, really kind of honing a focus on supporting and mobilizing instructors to develop learning environments that promote well-being. I'll share more about that story as I share in the workshop, but wanted to give you a little bit of background about me and where I'm coming from. Robin?
Yeah, it's great to be here. I'm excited to get into the slides and the presentation. I'm a nurse, so I've got sort of like a health frame, but I'm also been working in environmental justice. And it's interesting that, you know, we're a 3-campus university. So just to sort of point that out, that there's Seattle, but there's these 2 other campuses that University of Washington is part of, 2 other sort of separate, conjoined, weirdly, university systems. UW Tacoma is in the southern part of that section, and so we have our population that we're serving here is a lot more. It's a lot more of a teaching university down here, and we have a lot more diversity, I think, on our campus than you know, Seattle or the other campus. So we're in the thick of it, and I'm excited to start the presentation.
Thanks, Robin. So these are the learning outcomes from today. Essentially, I'm going to walk you through, Janet mentioned a Wellbeing for Life and Learning guidebook that she read this weekend. I'm going to talk about the Wellbeing for Life and Learning initiative at large and really kind of set the stage for how we began the initiative in the first place, and talk to you more specifically a bit about that guidebook and the framework that, that the guidebook is scaffolded on. And then Robin's going to share more directly about his experience teaching in the classroom, utilizing some of the skills and mindsets that we endorse through this initiative. And then we'll talk about some of the strengths and weaknesses and opportunities of the initiative as well, and allow time for us to be in conversation with you toward the end around how this relates to what you're striving to do at MIT, and to give you some, you know, to talk about some of the lessons learned in that regard. So to continue on, I don't think any information on this slide is going to be new information probably for anybody in this workshop today. But I think just in terms of context setting and level setting, it's important to kind of start here just around the kind of where we're at in regard to student mental health and well-being on campuses. You know, I think if we look at some headlines, the mental health realities on campus are described in some headlines as like a mental health crisis on campus. I think what we could say for certain is that we've certainly seen a rise in students presenting with different mental health issues as they come to campus over the past decade. Where UW maps onto that is that based on all this, the assessments and surveys that we've done on campus over the last decade, we really map onto the national trends. Our campus data mirrors that of what we see nationally. And what we also know is we've begun to really dig into what the relationship is between mental health and well-being, and also student academic success and progress toward graduation, and retention. So we have a retention study at the UW that revealed first in 2014, and then this was repeated again in more recent years, that emotional distress is the leading reason that students leave UW. So over 50% of students cited that the reason that they left was for emotional distress. And so this is something that the university is clearly interested in terms of thinking about how we can support students better, not only just to take care of them from like a public health point of view, to be able to address the public health concern of student mental health and well-being, but also as it pertains to UW's interest in retaining and graduating students. And then of course, we find ourselves this year amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, and that's also led to increased isolation, stress, grief and loss, and probably a lot of other factors that we're not even entirely aware of yet, but we'll come to understand as the year goes on and into the future. So given this, the mental health and well-being of students has become a priority really at kind of all levels of the system at the UW. And at the highest level in terms of like our president, Dr. Anamari Kelsey, and our provost, Dr. Mark Richards, 2 years ago, they charged a team at the UW to really take the student mental health and well-being situation and really come up with some new recommendations for the university that would be really meet the kind of current need of students in this moment. So really to do a rethinking and a revamp of our service delivery model, and to maybe think beyond the traditional modes of like mental health counseling that we've been operating under at the UW for years, and really think about like what would it look like to serve students today and now in 2021. So this led to a 24-page report entitled Investing in Student Mental Health. And you can download this if you're interested. I have links throughout the slide deck and you can have that. But what's wonderful is that like the thinking that went behind what the UW needs was really expansive, and includes some of the work that we're going to be talking about today. So just to connect the dots between the work that we're doing and we're going to be talking about today is really connected to this greater plan for student mental health and well-being across the university. One of the images that's in that report is this continuum of care model. And this is an imperfect model, you know, and we're actually in the midst of kind of rethinking it and wondering if there's ways that we could improve this model and what we're trying to communicate here. But for the sake of just showing you, what we're thinking about UW is really pulling from health services around step care models and continuum of care models, and really thinking about how can we make mental health and well-being really accessible to students across the university, no matter kind of what their needs are. So some students are going to have more serious needs and might be mental health counseling might be a really good fit, while other students that might not be the best fit. And so in all the recommendations that are presented in that report, they exist along this continuum. And also in this continuum is the idea that the services and programs that support student mental health and well-being would really be connected and coordinated across the university, and that some of the programs and services would be scalable. So if we look on this side of the continuum that's around prevention and promotion, that we would have programs that would really reach a lot of students, and not just programs such as your kind of like traditional prevention-based training, but also really thinking about how can we enlist the, you know, folks across campus, peers, staff, specifically student serving staff and instructors, in taking responsibility for supporting student mental health and well-being too, and creating a culture of well-being. And then on this other side of the continuum with treatment and recovery, there you'd see some of those more traditional modes of supporting students, like individual counseling. But even there, we're really thinking about, well, how can we make those programs more accessible for students these days, and rethinking that service delivery model too. But today we're going to be talking more specifically about the promotion and prevention end, and a program that we created that's really intended to be scalable. The cool thing is that then a couple weeks ago, in this journal, we have this quote: "Promoting student mental health and emotional well-being on campus requires more than a well-functioning counseling center. It calls for a campus-wide commitment and coordinated action plan." And you can read the rest of this editorial here. It's really a one-pager, and it's really a good read. But it really validated some of the thinking and direction that we're heading at the UW. And so I thought I would pull this in just to kind of show that even some of the thought leaders around this work across the country are also endorsing this idea of really kind of zooming out and inviting a campus approach to supporting students in this way. So as mentioned, I'm the director of the Resilience Lab. So the Resilience Lab fits into this, and why I shifted from that role as a strategic manager, manager of strategic initiatives for student wellness, to the director of the lab, is because when we were looking at the campus across that continuum, one area that we noticed was an area where there's a lot of really untapped potential, was reaching into the academic sphere to mobilize instructors and creating learning environments that promote well-being. And so with that opportunity, I moved over to the Resilience Lab, which is located in the academic realm of the university, situated within undergraduate academic affairs, and began leading some work that focuses on education, different research partnerships, and other core programs and initiatives. And some of the guiding questions in beginning this work were: one, how do we begin to create a culture of well-being at the University of Washington? Really from that way of inviting everybody into the work. What does care for the whole person mean within a large public research institution? So looking over at some of the institutions that we admired the way that they had a whole person approach, some institutions like Georgetown, locally here, Seattle U, those are Jesuit institutions where this care for the whole person is kind of baked into the way that the institution teaches from a really values perspective. And we began wondering what it looks like for a public institution to also teach from this kind of value set. And then finally, what's the role of social and emotional learning in higher education, knowing that social and emotional learning has about 25, 26 years of really great evidence-based research in K-12, and thinking about expanding that through undergraduate and graduate education to help students not only cope well while they're in college and transition well to college, but also transition well to their careers and be successful in their careers from a social and emotional point of view. So we went and did some benchmarking. First, we went to Georgetown University, flew to the East Coast and spent some time on campus learning about their Engelhard project, which at that time had been around for over a decade. The Engelhard project is a really awesome example of a program where faculty and instructors are invited to really incorporate and weave well-being into what they're teaching. So I talked to instructors firsthand one instructor who teaches applied math, and everything he does in applied math has to do with well-being. So his examples had to do with nutrition, blood alcohol content, gambling. It was very, very cool to be in conversation with these instructors who are really thinking creatively and out of the box about how to connect their course material to issues that connect to well-being. They have, at this point, a lot of instructors, hundreds of instructors engaged in their work. They meet in a community of practice monthly over breakfast. And so we drew some ideas from their program and brought them back to the University of Washington. I also met with some leaders at the University of Texas in Austin. They had created a guidebook here called Texas Wellbeing that you can download. They had a bit more of like a social and emotional learning approach to their initiative, where they had different skills and mindsets that they wanted instructors to incorporate into the way that they taught. So really thinking about like some practices around self-compassion and mindfulness and gratitude that instructors could do within their classroom to promote well-being. And this really was an important catalyst for us. We encouraged the instructors at the UW that we were working with to download this guidebook and to begin draw ideas from their guidebook. And Texas and Georgetown were just very, very generous with what they had created. And this became a really important foundation for us in the work that we're doing at the UW. So you can download the Texas guidebook here and learn more about their program. So we came back to campus and developed the Wellbeing for Life and Learning Initiative. Here, the purpose statement is to support faculty as they work to create learning environments that promote the health and well-being of their students. I'm going to just share a little bit about what we did. We started by engaging 40 instructors in around January of 2019. These instructors were motivated and interested in participating in our work. And they hailed from 3 different campuses, as Robin mentioned, Tacoma, Bothell, and Seattle, and from 17 different academic departments. So whereas like at the University of Texas at Austin, they really focused on a specific department first, where they really focused on, for example, like pharmacy or engineering, and we're trying to do deeper work within, a narrower scope. We decided to just engage more faculty across more departments and just go with that kind of decision. These faculty reached 4,000 students within a year. And so, and we were able to survey those students during the course of this time, as well as run some focus groups with faculty to learn not only how the initiative was impacting students, but also kind of what faculty experience was of participating in the initiative. We also assessed, we have a Distinguished Teaching Award program here at the UW that honors really awesome instructors. We assessed them, we sent them a survey to find out how they're promoting well-being within their learning environments, asking them very specifically, what do you do to promote growth mindset? What do you do to foster connection? What do you do to address racism and enhance equity? And we got really incredible data that we used then to create the guidebook. We developed in conjunction with these 40 instructors, as well as some students and other staff who are engaged with the Resilience Lab, we developed a framework that I'll share with you in a moment that became the way that we organized the guidebook. And then we co-authored the guidebook. We had a co-authoring process between students, undergraduate and graduate students who work within the Resilience Lab, instructors that really run along the continuum from like postdoc, graduate student instructors all the way through tenured instructors and staff. And so kind of breaking up some of the barriers that can exist at a university, we began a co-authoring, co-writing process between this intergenerational group of people to create the guidebook. And then we released the guidebook in the fall. So this is that guidebook that we keep talking about. You can also download this. It's an 87-pager combining research, teaching practices, personal testimony, with this intention to help instructors. So what we imagine with the guidebook is that folks would be able to sit down and read through it. They'd be able to open it and refer to it as needed, draw ideas from it. It has, it kind of helps explain kind of the research basis for different themes, like take an example of self-compassion. It provides a research basis. Then it provides recommendations for how you would apply that in your classroom. And then it also provides resources to turn to that are both resources that are kind of internal to UW's campuses, and then also ones that are external for anybody to draw from. This is our foundations for student well-being that the guidebook is organized around. It includes the first sections around teaching for equity and access, creating an atmosphere of belonging, and addressing power, privilege, and oppression in the classroom. For example, creating shared norms and expectations together as a class. The second is nurturing connection, tending to the social connectedness that students experience with others, and supporting students as they build stronger connections and awareness with themselves, such as encouraging peer interactions and study groups. The third is building resilience coping skills, teaching and modeling everyday practices to develop the 4 cornerstones of resilience: mindfulness, growth mindset, gratitude, and self-compassion. So this particular section has 4 subsections. And then finally, the 4th section is connecting to the environment and really drawing on the interconnectedness between the environment and the relationship between students and the places where they learn and grow. And so providing opportunities for students to learn outside. So that's the foundations. And then I will end with just sharing a quote from one of the instructors who's been engaged with our work from the beginning. This is Beck Tench. She's from our iSchool. Beck says, "Teaching this way encourages and allows me to teach from a place of authenticity. I show up to the class as my whole self and invite students to do so as well. This gives all of us more integrity, which overcomes imposter syndrome and opens our minds and hearts to new ways of thinking and being." Really awesome quote from Beck. I'm going to turn it over to Robin, who's going to actually just talk to you more like in just from personal experience about his engagement with this initiative.
All right, thanks a lot, Megan, very much for that. So, so this is sort of I got dragged into this work. Part of my story is to sort of like how I backed into this work through friends who said, "Hey, you know, there's a resilience lab over in Seattle, and we really should go up and talk to them because they're kind of thinking along the same lines as us in terms of the things that we should be doing." I'm going to take you through some of the things that I've been doing inside the classroom and some of the things that I've been doing to kind of expand the work beyond my classroom into kind of the field of teaching nurses and healthcare leaders. Here we are, proud South Sounders, home of Sir Mix-a-Lot, right in Tacoma. The little yellow triangle right there is where one of the largest parks in United States is, Point Defiance Park, bigger than Central Park, biggest municipal park, and home of Sir Mix-a-Lot and Frank Herbert from the Dune trilogy. This map is important because it's mapping from the Public Health Department ACEs scores for all of our county, and you can see that there's obviously the red ones have higher ACEs scores. If you don't know what an adverse childhood event scoring system is, it's something we're very concerned about inside public health and nursing. We've been tracking this ever since Ander and Folletti kind of came out with their stuff back in the 80s and the 90s, and really thinking about, well, how is this actually translating to our work in nursing? Pretty much there are 10 or 11 adverse childhood experiences being sort of codified, and if you have had more of those sorts of experiences, you tend to have long-term sequelae from that. Physical change, as well as some more chronic disease, more depression, and harder times working in the workplace, greater risk for incarceration. So we thought, well, what does that apply to nurses? This is a group of nurses I was doing doing field work with. We were doing social emotional learning with elementary school kids in a really battered little town in Pierce County, and so I just handed out these cards and asked them to score themselves on their ACEs and also on their resilience, and the results were really quite stunning for me. This is just an N of 12, but half of this group had more than 4 ACEs, and if you have more than 4 ACEs, it's really it's indicative that you're going to have problems in later life, right? compare it to the sort of CDC zone where it's not half of people have more than 4 ACEs, right, in the general population, as much as we can kind of understand. So it really got me thinking around what are we doing inside nursing and how are we actually preparing our nurses to be out there. We have, again, the same thing that Megan was saying, we have counseling support for this, but we're not necessarily doing it in the classroom. What can we do in terms of self-care pedagogy in nursing? And nurses are a funny crew because they tend to be, they do a lot of caring of other people, but they don't do a lot of self-care themselves. And especially during the COVID epidemic, we've been seeing rising rates of burnout inside nurses. We have a bottleneck problem getting people into nursing schools, and then we have this amazing drain that happens as soon as nurses hit the hospitals. Whereas over like 1 in 3 nurses quit after the first year. Why do they quit? Well, healthcare system is nuts anyway. But the other problem with it is that it's a cruel and unfortunate place to be if you're dealing with a lot of the baggage that you're bringing with you from traumatic experiences that you've had in childhood, right? And to be revisiting that. So we balance this idea of doing more trauma-informed work or doing more resilience work. We opted for, and really part of the inspiration of Megan and co, to really begin thinking around this as in terms of resiliency. We'll get to the sort of doing trauma-informed pedagogy, but we'll start off with really trying to experiment with how do we build our students, how do we make our students more resilient. So we did faculty and student focus groups, got some mixed results from the faculty. Some faculty don't think this has a place inside our education. That's still a challenge for us. And we kind of got a better idea from the students in terms of where they feel, what they feel is important in terms of their relationships with their instructors and how they work. And then we've ended up moving towards building our own sort of regional community of practice, but mimicking certainly the larger community of practice that happens at monthly with the Resilience Lab, but really focusing on our own regional community of nurse educators. So this is what I do now inside my classes. I've been focused largely on that. I think it was, Megan said it was number 3, the resiliency section. But really thinking about how do I do mindfulness in the classroom. It's a 5-minute opening session and it's brilliant. It's super. I'm not a mindfulness expert, right? But to do mindfulness with students on Zoom is amazing. They have bumped into your classroom after they've been 10 minutes. They took a 10-minute break somewhere else, and now they're into their next Zoom of maybe 3 Zoom experiences they do in a compressed day inside our program. And they're exhausted, and they haven't had any chance to think about themselves or kind of begin to embody themselves, right? Mindfulness there are some people who don't like mindfulness. They don't like thinking about their bodies, right? There are some issues within that. But certainly the overall practice and what I've seen is that these undergraduate students have not had an experience of actually sitting quietly and meditating and figuring that out inside themselves. So this is a sort of like a lifelong skill that I'm hoping to kind of seed in students. The other thing that's become really, really super important inside my work is fostering connectivity. And this project was sort of like also inspired by some DEI work I was doing and thinking around, oh, well, how do we build student connections? As soon as COVID happened, this became even more urgent for us to kind of recognize. And so building that into my classroom space now is a lot more focused on helping broker student relationships, building student to student connectivity that way. And then also this notion of faculty to student. We're fortunate we don't have huge class sizes in our program, but I make it a point of talking to my students on the telephone, on the old-fashioned telephone. Some of them prefer Zoom, but we do it mostly on the phone, twice a quarter. We have a 10-week quarter. So I pick up the phone and they get points for talking to me. But it's absolutely surprising that some students have never actually had an individual conversation with the faculty at the undergraduate level. They've been intimidated. They never thought it was possible. They've been so kind of wrapped up inside the power dynamics. They've never actually had a conversation. So while you can post office hours and wait for someone to come into the room, I go out and meet them. And that's been transformational. It's been actually a lifeline throughout the whole COVID experience. And lastly, the sort of fostering connectivity between faculty persons. This has really kind of come out inside of the community of practice work. but we are also completely isolated ourselves. And so how well we do in terms of connecting with ourselves is our own work for self-wellness. What I've learned from students in course evaluations is, one student talked about the mindfulness exercise quite considerably in terms of their resistance to it to start off with, and now they're rethinking around how important that is going to be for them inside their work. I mean, these students are pretty much going from here to the night shift COVID floors, right? That will transition with hope, but still, the immense amount of trauma that they are facing, having those kinds of skills in their pocket for maintaining their resilience beyond is really important. Talk a little bit about this community of practice that I've started, because we'll kind of get to this tool that I've been using that we developed out of our smaller community of practice. We have begun to really think about this. That continuum of care model is a good one, to really think about this work as being connected between the self, the relationships with others, and the relationship to your organization, right? To have that system perspective. I don't think this, if you talk about self-care with people, they think it's all about the individual, but actually self-care is interconnected with all of that. I'll kind of get to that because that's a sort of debate and a challenge for us in terms of being able to diffuse this innovation beyond the Resilience Lab and the work we're doing here in nursing. So when I met with these other nurses who are teaching in community and technical colleges, and we formed this collaborative, they really wanted to do. They identified they wanted to tackle trauma-informed systems in terms of the way they were working and what they were teaching in, trauma-informed clinical education. So definitely, there's a lot of bullying that goes on in nursing, and then transforming nursing culture to break the chain of trauma. Because in our nursing law, we talk about eating our young, and it's probably the same for other professions. I wanted to just share this compassion, awareness, resilience, and empowerment model. This is actually a faculty person on our group, Jane Thompson, who kind of developed this for the healthcare professions. But it's a really important kind of nice mnemonic that helps me get through a 10-week quarter. I basically do two on each one of these over a course of 8 weeks, and then we wrap it up in the beginning and the end with something else. But really sort of the compassion bit is the mindfulness practice, right? But this idea that, and this is difficult for people to get, and nurses kind of they say, I've got compassion fatigue. I'm tired of caring for people. And we argue actually it's empathy fatigue. It's not compassion fatigue. Compassion is this limitless well that we have inside ourselves to love people, right? It's not containable. But empathy takes work, right? Getting inside someone's shoes takes work. So trying to explain that to students. This awareness technique, if you're a parent with small kids, you're probably using this already in your house because it's been in assisted development circles for years and years and years. But the 5-4-3-2-1 method of just centering yourself and calming down is super. 5 things you can see, 5 things you can touch, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. If you go through all of that, it takes about a minute and a half. You're centered again. You're back inside your body. Resilience thinking is another thing that my brother-in-law Steve does with his family every day, and I just thought, well, that's brother-in-law Steve for you. But it turns out that it's just a widely accepted practice of thinking about 3 good things. And last week in class we couldn't do 3 good things because we had too big a class, but we did 1 good thing. It took us about 15 minutes, but it was amazing. It was just amazing to see. One person said, well, my partner made me pizza tonight because it's a late night class. I went for a walk with my dog. I had a chat with my grandmother. Each one of these moments that the student gets to share in class builds that connectivity across the whole class, right? We see our humanity, and that's really sort of part of that the last one in this, in terms of thinking around empowerment, sort of modeling that we've been doing inside our classrooms, has been to really sort of think about those values affirmation. Megan kind of touched on this as well, but really thinking about some point in time when you were loyal to someone, right? Really beginning to think about and recognize that you have these values in your own self, that you have this inner power. You think of an example back in your life that you've used, and you have that. So that's coming up for me in the next 2 weeks of class, and I can't wait to do it with my students. A little bit about our next steps. We published some stuff in about our work inside a trade kind of journal for nurses across the state, nursing educators across the state. We're thinking about having a roundtable with other nursing educators to talk about some core issues. We're thinking around, we're continuing to use kind of like this idea around action inquiry to kind of improve our practices inside our community of practice. And we're looking at system change as well. We're sort of asking ourselves, where is our, nursing-wide commitment to student emotional and mental well-being, especially in terms of the sort of colonial oppression of accreditation, state regulations. Some of that stuff comes all the way from Nightingale, and I am to blame because she's British and I'm British. But we've inhabited that inside our things. And the other thing was beginning to look at and toggle with, and certainly when people are opening up the anti-racism window right now and thinking around their school goals and how do we get anti-racist practice involved, people are beginning to think about changing school and program goals. I will end with this sort of challenge that we have, is that we've got to be able to hold and do this work of anti-racism and anti-colonialist orientations in terms of our practice and in terms of our sort of pedagogy. That requires reflexivity. That's dangerous, right? Because it requires us to kind of acknowledge our own sense of weaknesses and stuff like that. And credit to communities of practice groups and Megan's group. There's a lot of support that people need for the emotional work that needs to go on to be able to do this teaching in this particular way. And then there's pushback, right? And certainly I'm sharing this quote because this is written by a fellow faculty member who works here, a dean of color, who is pushing against this idea that of what self-care means. And he said, that she's quoting a podcaster where someone says he's never been privileged enough to think about self-care like many of you. Perhaps we should decenter the notion of the self-care, especially at the moment. It should be about community care, soul care, and spirit care. I think what Rachel Endo is talking about is really that system thinking, right? I think she's thinking around how do we get to this new movement, which isn't necessarily white people going to an ashram in India and getting fixed, right? But it is about this communal work that we need to do to change our systems. So I think we're still in an early adopter stage inside the diffusion of innovation model in terms of what we're trying to do at UW. We've got a long way to go. We're not at the top of the hill, but we certainly have learned a lot along the way so far. That's the end of my presentation. I gotta escape from here.
Thanks, Robin. And I'm going to share my screen again. Here we go. And just move here. So, bringing Robin to be able to share about his experiences with you is in one way to reflect how what we're thinking around the Wellbeing for Life and Learning initiative, we understand is not a one-size-fits-all approach across the whole university. And what different departments and communities need varies from some of the departments that are within the STEM fields, medical fields, social work, public health. And so to hear Robin talk about the way that this has been applied and maps on to some of their goals within nursing, I thought is a really great example of how you can create kind of, a central community of practice that's interdisciplinary and have a guidebook that can help kind of anchor some ideas. Our community of practice meets monthly. We use the guidebook as kind of like an anchor point, something we refer to each month, different sections. But then here you see Robin has taken the inspiration and brought it into his department and his broader community of colleges and technical colleges around the region to think about what are the implications for this field generally. And to me, around that diffusion of innovation is just like so much promise there. Like we have somebody else in the College of Medicine, our School of Medicine, who's thinking about developing a community or practice specifically within that realm. Somebody else within our STEM departments who's considering the same. And that to me is really exciting. I wanted to share before we wrap up here and shift to questions, just to be really transparent, like Robin said, we have a long way to go in some of the ways that the moment we're in is analyzing what we've done so far and what in a traditional SWOT analysis frame, what the strengths and weaknesses, opportunities or threats are. So just to provide a few examples, you know, we feel good, for example, about the guidebook incorporating a lot of spotlights of folks on campus really modeling the work that we're promoting, and really kind of doing some norming around. Look at these really cool instructors and students who are leading efforts that are connected to these 4 themes. On the other hand, some of the areas that we noted as weaknesses or gaps, when we started that initial community of practice I mentioned, we really just put out a call and people who were intrinsically motivated around this work came together, and it turned out that that group had an overrepresentation of white faculty. And that matters because context matters and identity matters. And we've heard from instructors since that, you know, hey, as a Black instructor who's a postdoc teaching an intro level chem class, for me to you know, pull on some of these recommendations, lead a mindfulness activity is really different than take you know, an instructor within the Graduate School of Social Work where that might be more of a norm. And so it's been important for us to recognize that not every instructor can you know, can facilitate this work in the same way, and that there might be some risks for some instructors to do so, in fact. So in terms of opportunity, I think we're in a moment, as Robin was showing with that diffusion of innovation model, where we could start to expand the initiative. That's where the opportunity is. I have a meeting later today with the Dean of the Business School at UW-Tacoma as an example. And so maybe as we get more deans interested in this work, it'll, you know, we'll have more departments taking it on fully. We've had a little bit of a grassroots approach, but now I think we'll have more of like a top-down, bottom-up approach to diffusing the information. And then lastly, you know, some of the threats or concerns that we understand are folks wondering if this means like, you know, how can I take 15 minutes to do something in my class? Time is limited, or what does this have to do with student academics? And, you know, or how can you ask me to do more than I'm already doing? So there's a lot of kind of questions that instructors have about the work that we need to kind of consider working with. So that's just an example of our SWOT. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is that, you know, we're not wanting this work to exist, you know, as a separate initiative, a siloed initiative running along parallel to other initiatives on campus, but rather we want to be really thinking about the ways in which different big initiatives on campuses really are levers for each other, inform each other, and are moving toward common outcomes. So the 40 instructors who have been involved in our work over the last year have made a request to, as we develop a new race and equity initiative, which we refer to as a diversity blueprint for campus, the request is, can we integrate social and emotional learning, or this well-being for life and learning approach, into that, knowing that social emotional learning is often described as a lever for equity. And if you think about like the framework that we're working from, around addressing racism, inequity, student connection, building resilience, coping skills, we can see that very much a part of some of the other efforts around race and equity. So for example, the Resilience Lab is collaborating closely with our Center for Communication, Difference, and Equity, who does a lot of our work around addressing racism on campus. And they're understanding some of the skills and mindsets that we're teaching is very important to doing that work, because it requires having, you know, being able to manage stress, be able to have interpersonal effectiveness, be able to understand our emotions as they're coming up, and have some space to be able to make some decisions around the ways that we react or respond to different, you know, stimulus or situations. And so really being able to connect those dots. We're also a Carnegie School, so really thinking about this work as related to that initiative. you know, as one of our deans says, what the Carnegie Foundation work is really about encouraging students and staff and instructors to really dig into those precarious, wicked problems in our community that don't have easy solutions or technical solutions. Mental health being one of them, addressing racism and equity being another one of them. And so again, making the connection that our ability to step into the adaptive challenge of mental health and well-being on campus is kind of part and parcel to our work around community engagement, but doing so in our own backyard here on campus. And so, yeah, mostly just wanting to show this idea that it's really important as we do this work to really connect the dots with the other bigger initiatives on campus so that they are seen as informing and supporting each other. So I'll close there. I'm going to return back to that quote from the beginning, that this requires more than a well-functioning counseling center, but rather calls for a campus-wide commitment and coordinated action plan. And with that, Robin and I will be open to answering any of your questions, and then also pose a question to you around how you plan to address the call to action here at MIT, and what opportunities you see exist for instructors to play a role in supporting student well-being. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing so we can see all of you.
Thank you so much, Megan and Robin. Really appreciate it. Very incredibly interesting. We do have a few comments in the Slido, and I had sent them to Robin, and he's actually answered them in the chat, but I think it only went to me. So do you want to say a few words, actually maybe repeating the questions as you go there, those first two questions, Robin?
Sure. They're good questions. One was about in STEM fields, resiliency feels like a given, constant failing, which I'm not quite sure about, but how do you tackle resiliency with microaggressions and belonging, especially in people of color? And then a second one about how do you introduce practices that you did in your classes? How much time do you spend incorporating these exercises? And I'll just start with the first one, because it's a really important thing. The DEI work is fundamentally intertwined with this self-care. That's how I see it. The DEI people, or the DEI groups, right, on campus, of which I've been a part of and mixed in and out of, and I did some DEI work, right? So I've got my junior ranger DEI badge, but I don't have, you know, the senior ranger. But at the same time, they don't necessarily always see the self-care group as being intertwined with them. So that's on the sort of faculty to faculty level. So that's where some of the difficult work goes on. But I see it, I see the DEI work as being intertwined and fundamental. And I think the role you take as a professor is important, right? So it definitely getting better at recognizing and calling out microaggressions in the classroom and being able to like freeze the class. This is the work we have to do. Sorry, rest of the curriculum, sorry objectives, but this is the work we have to do right here, right now. Right, so that's clear to me. How to do that sometimes is difficult, and part of that is becoming very, very comfortable being vulnerable. And for me, my new phrase of the day is leaving my white privilege at the door. Right, so to be able to kind of go, okay, I'm going to be vulnerable, and I might be hurt, but that's okay because I'm super white privileged guy right here. But it's terrifying and scary to be able to do that, right? And then the idea of belonging is huge, and I'm so puzzled by that right now inside this Zoom space with our students who've been with us a whole year, and they're only here for us for 4 quarters. They're finishing their BSNs. I don't know how much belonging they have to us through this screen. But one of the things I did notice was getting the students out around campus, because we're a commuter campus, when they're inside doing scavenge hunts, getting them to, teaching outside, but also getting them to do activities with our sort of related amenities around this campus was super important for them to feel connected and to feel a sense of belonging. But I'm not sure whether I've totally answered that question. The second one was really about sort of introducing the practices. And I just go, you know, I kind of the way I introduced it to you, right? We need resiliency in nursing. We want to keep you in your jobs when you get out of here, kind of a thing. And so we are going to do this. And the students are sort of cool with that mostly at the beginning because you're in charge, right? The power relations haven't been tested, and they're still working out who you are and what's going on. But in a 2.5 hour class, I'll commit 15 minutes to doing maybe one of those sorts of exercises, and then throughout trying to work on connectivity. Really trying to work on connectivity, because that's something that you can do, and something it's pedagogically kind of easier to really think about that. But that connectivity is the human part of yourself, right? So Zoom's been wonderful for that. We have when we take a break for toilet, I don't know who else does this. When we take the potty break or whatever, we get someone to put their cat on the screen, and we just look at the cat, for those of us who don't have anything better to do. And it's lovely. Or a dog. Dogs don't stay around as well as cats do, but that's something we've done.
Great, thank you. There's three other questions that are sort of related. And Megan, maybe it would be great if you could take those. One is, I'll just give you all three and you can answer them as you wish. What are the barriers for widespread adoption of these practices? And how do you envision bringing more instructors on board? That's one question. And then the other question is related. They say, how did you get more faculty besides after this original 40 that sort of self-selected potentially? And then are you doing some ongoing workshops for people about how to, like specific workshops for how to adopt practices from the guidebook, for example? So
Great
the first two are pretty similar.
Yeah, great question. And so I think when I shared the SWOT, I presented one of the issues with going with the 40 folks who were kind of intrinsically motivated because of the group was somewhat homogenous. On the other hand, like one of the strengths of going with that group of 40 is that they're really strong ambassadors for the work. And they were really motivated to help us co-author the guidebook and to promote the work within their respective communities across the 17 academic departments. So utilizing that core group to help us think about to help kind of promote and bring on other instructors who might be interested in this work is one strategy. When the guidebook was, so the guidebook was a very intentional piece of this. We figured in order to generate buy-in across the campuses, we needed to have a really clear, kind of set of recommendations from which we were operating from. So the guidebook really helps articulate what we're, the research basis, which would help with some instructors, which is a barrier. Instructors understanding the value add for teaching. And it also gives them very practical how-to strategies for how to implement this work. So if you're listening today and you're like, wait, I want a little bit more understanding of like what I can actually do, the guidebook is just pages and pages of ideas, and hopefully really easy to read and adopt. And so the guidebook was a strategy. And then the provost and our dean of undergraduate academic affairs, they sent that guidebook out across all three campuses to all teaching professors. And so that led to a lot more visibility of the Resilience Lab and the initiative overall, which helps us in creating a community of practice. So now we'll both expand our interdisciplinary tri-campus community of practice that meets monthly. We used to meet in person and have breakfast like they do at Georgetown because we loved that idea. Now we meet on Zoom. And we'll also support the emergence of new communities of practice across campus. So for example, we might see communities of practice that are interdisciplinary, like within the School of Business or within the medical school. And that could have, a lot of strengths as well. Very open to leading more and planning on leading more workshops and trainings around the specifics of the guidebook, like the recommendations within around how to promote equity and address racism, promote student connectivity, build resilience coping strategies, and connect to the environment. And also happy to draw on the instructors who are doing those practices to help facilitate those.
Great. We have technically 2 minutes, but maybe -3 minutes, depending on what clock you're watching. I think can Megan and Robin hang around for just a little bit longer, maybe 5 minutes or so past the hour. And then of course we understand if folks need to leave because it's just about 1 o'clock, but we've opened up the mic. So if anybody does have a question, I will look at the participant list and see who gets their hand up first and call on you if you raise your hand.
I've been enjoying Frido's chats.
Yeah.
I love the idea. I do honestly. In all seriousness, it's this element of play, right? That you have. It's sort of acknowledging this informal space. We did focus groups with our students after going into Zoomland, and you know, now we all know this, but at that time we were so worried that they weren't going to kind of connect. But they just felt like they actually saw their professors' homes, they saw their professors' lives, and seeing that is so good. It enriches the opportunity to dialogue together.
Great. Any other questions? I'm not seeing any hands here.
I will say that if anybody wants to reach out specifically to me with any follow-up questions pertaining to anything that was shared today or any other specific questions, please feel free. I'd love to talk in more depth with anybody who wants to learn more about our strategy around campus writ large, or also just more kind of go dive into more of the recommendations specifically. I'm open to that.
Thank you so much. And thank both of you for your amazing work and for taking the time to talk with us today. So I know there's a lot of interest here, and I'm sure people will be reaching out. So
Yeah.
thank you very much.
Thank you, Janet. And thanks again, Ryan. And thanks for everyone for attending today.
Thanks. Thank you.